Many critics and fans of Ayn Rand think of her as belonging within the conservative movement. This view is often reinforced when prominent conservative figures often come out and say that they are fans of the Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. And yet, Ayn Rand herself rejected this linkage with conservatism. She rejected it often and vocally. And she rejected the label of conservative. She did not believe she was one. And it wasn't simply that she was critical of conservatism as a movement. She repudiated it. Why? What did she object to? What was her evaluation of conservatism? Welcome to the New Ideal podcast. I'm Elan Journo, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Keith Lockitch. Hey, Keith.
Hi, Elan.
I think a place to start here is to say a little bit more about this linkage with conservatism, because I think there's a real issue here. It's understandable from a certain perspective why people put these two together, but then we should talk about why this is a mistake. So one of the impetus for this conversation today is the article that I wrote in New Ideal, which I encourage people to take a look at. But maybe why don't you start us off with some of the reasons people think of her as connected to conservatism?
I mean, to the extent that people associate conservatism with, opposition to the progressive liberal left, and in some ways as being more on the side of, free markets and capitalism and that sort of thing. I think it's natural, to the extent that they understand what she stands for, it's natural to sort of lump her in with them. And her critics often sort of deliberately try to lump her in with conservative people and views that they disagree with, partly as a way of, smearing her. And we saw that a lot in the pandemic. I mean, the number of people who tried to associate some of just the most worst irrational views about the pandemic and how it should be handled and blame that on her, even though a lot of the things that they were saying she stands for is the opposite of what she stands for. So I think there are a lot of reasons why it's natural to do this and why people might think of her as a conservative.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of one-way relationship with people who read her books and then later in life or at some point think of themselves as conservatives, so that she does have an influence on conservatives, people in the movement or who vote in that particular direction or see themselves as affiliated with that movement. But it doesn't mean that she's part of that movement, because you can have an influence on something and still be standing apart from it. And I think that's important. So when you hear about people like Clarence Thomas, who is a Supreme Court judge, who apparently he likes to show the movie of the Fountainhead to some of his clerks. And I think Ted Cruz famously in a 21-hour filibuster speech quoted from Atlas Shrugged and described it as one of his favorite books. So those things are not surprising in an important respect, because she is widely read, and she's widely read both by people who think of themselves as conservatives, but also by people who do not. And I think that's an important feature of her appeal. So let's dive into this question of what is it, how did she think of conservatism? What was her assessment of it? Why did she repudiate it? And to sort of frame that conversation, I want to say that what we're describing is her assessment, not of people who are supporters of various conservative figures over time, voted for Reagan or not Reagan, or whoever you think of as a sort of typical conservative leader. Instead, we're thinking of the intellectual spokespeople, the intellectual leadership of the conservative movement. And throughout the conversation, I'm not going to do it every time, but throughout the conversation, when I say conservatism or conservatives, I'm putting air quotes around it. I'm not going to keep doing that, but the reason for that is that Ayn Rand often did, and it was a way for her to signal there's a real question what this term means, and it was also a way of signaling that she stands apart from it. But to avoid it being tedious, I'm just going to put that out there at the beginning, and then we can roll with that. And I think the other framing point to make here is this is Ayn Rand's view that we're going to discuss, and so it it's framed by the period when she was writing public commentary. We'll talk a bit more about sort of the backstory of how she was interested in this phenomenon, but it's really drawing on her published statements from about 1960 through the early 1980s. 1981 is the sort of the bookmark for this. So the focus is not people who voted conservative and her evaluation of them. That's not the assessment. The assessment is of the intellectual movement as she saw it during her lifetime. I mean, there are implications for that, but that's not really the focus of our conversation.
Yeah, I mean, her whole understanding of history and what moves history is that it's ideas, and so it's the intellectual spokesman and the views articulated by the leaders of the conservative movement that she's interested in. She had a fair bit of experience with conservatism through the 30s, 40s, 50s, building up to the period that you want to focus on in this discussion. But I think it's worth saying a little bit about her background and what her interactions were with conservatives and the conservative movement prior to this time, because I think it sets helpful context for it. So for people who don't know that much about her biography, I'll just give the 30-second version. So she was born in 1905 in Tsarist Russia, and she saw the communists take over and change the country into the Soviet Union. She managed to get out. She came to the US in 1926. And what she expected, so she'd learned a little bit about America in school, and what she expected to find when she got to America was the land of the Declaration of Independence and the Founding Fathers. And what she found instead, she was in the late 1920s and the 1930s, this was the so-called Red Decade, when America's intellectual leaders were staunch supporters of communism. So she just saw all the horrors perpetrated by communism and its ideology, and she thought she was leaving that. She came to the States, and what she found was people advocating the same ideology here. And the progressive movement, which was sort of a more incremental approach to the same collectivist ends as the communists, was in full swing, gaining political support. FDR got into power. Franklin Delano Roosevelt got into power in 1932 and started to enact the New Deal, this huge expansion of the welfare state and the regulatory state. So in the 1940 presidential election, so this was Roosevelt campaigning for an unprecedented third term in office. He'd been putting his New Deal into practice for 8 years. And Ayn Rand, thought that this is not a good thing. And she was she decided to become active in politics. She volunteered for the campaign of the Republican presidential candidate who was running against Roosevelt, Wendell Willkie, who was sort of a New York businessman who was going to, fight the New Deal. So she took time off from writing The Fountainhead. She volunteered for the Willkie campaign to try to defeat FDR. She gave speeches in his defense. I mean, she wasn't just sort of stuffing envelopes in the newsroom. She was writing position papers and articulating ideas, trying to really help make this campaign happen. And she became completely disillusioned, even before the results of the election, at the total lack of firm, clear principles on the part of Willkie and his campaign. And of course, Willkie lost, real badly, and Roosevelt was reelected. So this is some of her. So she was politically active. She was interested, and she was trying to work with people, within the conservative movement, again, to fight against the kinds of trends that she thought were bad. After The Fountainhead was published in 1943, again, she became very active in trying to rally support for the so-called conservative side. She joined a group called the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, which was sort of a group of Hollywood conservatives who were alarmed at the extent of communist infiltration into the film industry. So you had people like Walt Disney and Gary Cooper, formed this group. And again, she wrote position papers. She articulated the moral and political principles that she thought were necessary to defend American ideals. And again, she ended up being disillusioned, disappointed at the total lack of principles and the general ineffectiveness of these groups. So she had experience with people within the conservative movement who were trying to uphold so-called American ideals. And the problem is with how they understood those ideals and what they stood for. So that's something we could talk about next, is what, Elan, if we think about in this period, what is it that people saw conservatism as standing for, and what were they standing against, and what were they standing for?
I think it's a great place to dive into her analysis of conservatism, because if you were living at that time and you were reading the newspaper and listening to the radio and sort of trying to figure out what's going on in the world, what would your view of conservatism be? How would you understand it? And then we can look at how the leaders of the movement themselves articulated it. And I think a reasonable person would look at conservatism at that time, and what some of the salient things they would pick out are, there's an opposition to communism. I think that was one of maybe the salient thing. Opposition to liberals, so the other side, the other political faction at the time. I think not opposition, maybe suspicion is a fairer way of putting it. Suspicion towards the calls for welfare state programs. If you think about what Roosevelt did with the New Deal, now this was now starting to really mushroom into many more other kinds of programs over time. And I think the one way that this would be captured by some of the political figures and some of the intellectuals is they want, quote, limited government, unquote. And then the question then to what you're raising, Keith, is, well, what does all this add up to? What is limited government limited to? What constrains it? And this question of what conservatism was for is, I think, central to Ayn Rand's analysis of it and core to why she thought it was problematic. Now, you mentioned the phrase, the American way of life, I think, just a few minutes ago. And I think that's really helpful, because if you look at some of what the political figures and intellectuals were saying, that was their slogan or their keyword for, this is what we're about. We're about the American way of life. And yeah. But that doesn't really answer the question, what is the American way of life, right?
Yeah, I think you're right so as if you look at the dominance of Marxism and communism in the intellectual scene in the 30s and 40s, and then as you head into the period after World War II, when the communist bloc is expanding and this large looming threat in the world, as you transition into the Cold War, there's a lot of what was going on with conservatives at the time is more, it's more a reaction against that. Like we want to fight the whole progressive trend, and they see it as somehow moving away from the founding principles of America, but and that the American way of life, American ideals, these are things that they want to defend against these large geopolitical things that are happening in the world. But again, the question is, what do they mean by the American way of life? What are the ideals that they claim to want to be upholding? And I mean, for Rand, that's the most important question, because those are the principles that you're trying to defend. That's what it means, to take this side of the conflict.
So I think this is where we can start to sketching in a bit her own critique of what was going on. And the way into the topic is to see that she had a philosophic view of what a free society depends on. So if you asked her what is the American way of life, she would say it's something really profound. It's a view of society where individuals are the unit, they're the sort of the focus of society and government. And a free society is what the founders built, and they were influenced by a whole progression of intellectual development to get to the point where they had this conception of a new way of organizing government. So in her view, capitalism is at the core of a free society. It's a system that protects individual rights. And underneath that political system is a conception of the individual's moral right to his and her own life. And that is the idea of egoism. And in her view, and this is a really important part of her analysis, is that the achievement of the founders is that they got to the philosophic ideas and built a political application of those ideas. But the crucial moral ideas were left implicit in that system. So if you think about the Declaration of Independence, it talks about the pursuit of happiness, and it's really individual focused. And that is all a huge achievement. It's not taking anything away from that. But her account is that this moral foundation of freedom needs a philosophic defense, an explicit, solid foundation for it to be, to ensure that the political system that is built on that can survive and be consistently protective of individual freedom. And that's what was missing. So this was one of the shortcomings of the American founding, which was an only implicit understanding or support for egoism or individualism in morality. And that this is what any defense of the American way of life needs to understand and needs to really provide a philosophic defense for freedom. And that is what she expected to see here when she came here, and what she herself was really active in trying to provide.
Yeah. And I think this became, completely clear to her by the time she finished writing Atlas Shrugged. So in the 30s and in the 40s, after she completed The Fountainhead in 1943, I think she was still looking for allies within the conservative movement, hoping that there was an understanding, or that she could convince people of what the moral and political foundations of this country really are. I think by the time she finishes Atlas Shrugged in 1957, and we start to move into the period of the 1960s, she had worked out in full detail the essential principles of her philosophy, Objectivism. And I think it's much clearer to what extent it's a radical departure from the prevailing views in the culture on both the left and the right. I mean, two features in particular, I think you can see would set her up already right in opposition to the burgeoning conservative movement. So in particular, her defense of reason, and as a consequence of being a staunch upholder, defender of reason, the total rejection of anything resembling religious faith or belief in the supernatural. And she has a radical theory of morality that basically rejects everything that people have held in ethics since the Sermon on the Mount. And this is the basis. I mean, what you were just describing about egoism as the foundation for individualism in politics. It's a radical perspective that she has on morality that informs her views on the moral foundations of politics. So we have a video clip. By 1962, this issue, I think, is completely clear to her that there's a basic contradiction at the founding of America between these implicit moral principles that gave rise to our capitalist system of individual rights and the prevailing moral views that have existed for 2,000 years. So if we could cue up this clip, let's take a listen to what she has to say about this issue and about this clash.
Capitalism was the system originated in the United States. Its success, its progress, its achievements are unprecedented in human history. America's political philosophy was based on man's right to his own life, to his own liberty, to the pursuit of his own happiness, which means on man's right to exist for his own sake. That was America's implicit moral code, but it had not been formulated explicitly. This was the flaw in her intellectual armor, which is now destroying her. America and capitalism are perishing for lack of a moral base. The destroyer is the morality of altruism. Altruism holds that man has no right to exist for his own sake, that service to others is the only moral justification of his existence, and that self-sacrifice is his highest moral duty. The political expression of altruism is collectivism or statism, which holds that man's life and work belong to the state, to society, to the group, the gang, the race, the nation, and that the state may dispose of him in any way it pleases for the sake of whatever it deems to be its own tribal collective good. From her start, America was torn by the clash of her political system with the altruist morality. Capitalism and altruism are incompatible. They cannot coexist in the same man or in the same society.
So I think this sets up the key point that I think we want to get to, which is the central charge that Ayn Rand levels against conservatism as an intellectual movement. And that, in brief, is that it's intellectually bankrupt. So talk about being really frank and to the point. It's intellectually bankrupt. So given her analysis of what is at the root of America's crisis, this moral crisis, that if capitalism is to survive, there's a need for a philosophic defense of its moral base. Given that, what is it that conservatism is doing in the time that she's seeing it, from the period 60s onward, I think? And her argument is that it's evading that whole issue. It's looking away or trying to avoid it, sidestep it, cover it up with camouflage, this whole expression, the American way of life. She talks about how this is a kind of a smokescreen or just a way of talking around the issue and not really admitting that there's a moral question here that needs to be addressed. And she regards this as reprehensible. And this is, to just put this in context, she regards the liberal push or the progressive push for welfare statism and collectivism as evil. There's no question about that. She has no sympathy for that whole approach. She regards it as fundamentally evil. And she regards what the conservatives are doing, which she characterizes as evading the issue. She regards that as even more reprehensible, because what they're trying to do, seeming from her analysis, is they're trying to push freedom. So they claim to promote freedom, but to do it in a kind of cowardly or stealthy way, not really admitting what the issues are. And she regards this as not only disreputable, but it's bound to fail. And she has an argument for why this is going to work out that way. So I think this is at the core. So it's an intellectually bankrupt movement that is scurrying around the core issue and avoiding it. And in fact, it isn't just a default. And this is to the other element of her analysis. It isn't just that they're looking the other way. It's their unwillingness to question the predominant moral view, which is altruism. So if altruism is what has come to prevail in the society of America and is eating away at the foundations of capitalism and a free society, what, in her view, conservatism is doing is it's accepting that moral basis and then claiming to be for freedom. And so there's a fundamental contradiction there as well. And I think we should talk a bit about how she regards this as how this plays out in their account.
Yeah, I mean, the clip that we played, I think expresses very clearly her view that in order to understand the basis of the founding of America, you have to understand, in order to support it and provide a philosophical foundation for it, you have to be willing to repudiate altruism. You have to be willing to say, the dominant moral perspective that people have held since the Sermon on the Mount is wrong and is actually in contradiction with the American way of life. And that's I think that's hard for a lot of people to accept. And it takes courage of convictions, and it takes a real understanding of the principles involved. And her view of the conservatives is that they didn't want to face that issue. They didn't want to face the fact that what they were trying to, they're trying to oppose communism, they're trying to fight the progressives, they're trying to defend the American way of life, but they don't want to recognize the fact that in order to do that, they've got to be radicals they have to have a radical reconceptualization of what the basic principles of morality are and how that leads into politics. So instead, as a result of not wanting to face that issue, they sort of retreated to standard, the kind of a set of arguments and a set of viewpoints that are totally ineffectual because they don't address these fundamental issues that need to be addressed. So, you wrote about, you kind of summarized her perspective on this and some of her views on these the arguments that conservatives would offer at the time. So what are some of those arguments that they would offer, and what's
let's talk a bit about those arguments. There's two aspects I want to draw out. One is the arguments that they make in advocating for freedom, or their seeming advocacy for freedom, and what is deplorable about them in her view. And then the other element to draw out is the issue that by conceding the morality of altruism, they in effect pave the road for their own opponents. And I think both of those are important for understanding how she sees this. So let's talk about the arguments that she analyzes. And important to see throughout all this is she's looking at the dominant figures, the intellectual leaders of the movement, or the ones that she regards as serious and meaningful. So if you studied the history of conservatives, you might find better people, but that's not the issue here. The question is, were they influential in the movement? And in her analysis, the influential positions were the ones that she took on. She analyzed 3 arguments that she saw as connected and that were really bubbling up to the surface among conservative intellectuals and spokespeople. And one of them is the argument from tradition, which is that the American way of life, this is how it's always been. We need to preserve tradition. That's what we're conserving. And for each of these arguments, and I'm not giving the full justification of the argument, I'm just giving you kind of a headline. The whole point of my bringing this up is I want people to go read her analysis because I think it's really trenchant. So this is just a headline level summary. But at a first blush, you can see that if knowing anything about the founding of America, read just a bit of the Federalist Papers and you'll discover that part of what the founders were doing was breaking away from tradition. And they were really questioning all traditions in political theory at the time. So that's not really an argument grounded in the facts, but it is a kind of argument that you might see people resort to if they don't feel they have a good, positive argument to offer. It's sort of something people often fall back on. It's always been like this. This is what we're conserving. Another one is the argument from faith, which is the idea that this is, God. I'm not sure quite how to put it, not in conventional contemporary terms, but sort of in the view that this is America is a religious society at its root, and this is how we need the defense of freedom comes from some conception of God and religion. And this again, I think, really cuts against the history of how America came about and the fact that religion is not a political issue. It's seen, or was properly seen, as a private matter in the development of sort of the political conception of our society. And she has a really... Go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, and what I think also this is partly... they're positioning themselves against the communists, and there's the perception that and this is a viewpoint that the Marxists put forward, that they represent a secular scientific worldview, that's based on reason, and they're gonna, the Soviet world is going to outstrip the West because they've got a scientific approach to the economy. And so in response to that, the conservatives, saw themselves as fighting the godless communist atheists, the atheistic communists. And part of what we need to fight that is a return to religion. And Ayn Rand's view is exactly the opposite, that it's a mistake to view the communists as, even though they're nominally atheists, it's a mistake to view them as defenders of reason, defenders of science, because essentially what this perspective is it's a secularized version of a whole religious worldview, including the religious ethics. I mean, the moral principles that are embodied in these regimes it's basically the Sermon on the Mount put into a secularized form. The idea that we're our brother's keeper, that our duty is to sacrifice for the sake of others, whether, in religion, your duty is to sacrifice for the sake of God, but in the secularized version of it, your duty is to sacrifice for the state, for the proletariat, for the collective. So in her view, it's no accident that communism took hold and took over the country in Russia, because she viewed Russia as one of the most mystical, countries, and the people of Russia were deeply religious with the Russian Orthodox Church, and it was an easy transition from the irrational mysticism of the Russian Orthodox Church to transition over to the irrational mysticism of Marxist dialectical materialism and all the irrational ideas that go along with that. So the idea that the way to fight, the secular atheist communists is by a return to religion is exactly the opposite of the truth in her view. What's needed is a defense of reason, and part of what the reason she's so condemnatory about this is because, in effect, by accepting the idea that the communists and the progressives have reason on their side, you're basically conceding that to them and saying that that freedom, to defend freedom, requires irrationality in religion, and that if you were going to be scientific and secular, then you'd have to be a leftist. And to her that is a totally false, and it's the worst kind of concession, because you're conceding that they have reason on their side.
Yeah, I think that's an important observation you're raising, Keith. The idea, so she has an interesting perspective on how capitalism is seen and what appeal it can offer people and what kind of people it will attract and what kind of people certain arguments will push away. And combined with the third argument, which she characterizes as the argument from depravity, and that is that we're all fallen creatures, none of us is good enough to be a dictator, therefore we have to have freedom. That's just sort of a headline version of that argument. She regards that as the rejection of real ideals in human life and the idea that you can better your position in life. And it clashes fundamentally with capitalism, which is about growth and innovation and progress and making things better and finding better ways to do things, more efficient ways to do things. And it clashes fundamentally with her conception of the value of the human life and that what you can achieve in your life, and that it's proper and important to have a vision of your own life as something to build and develop and really invest in. You can see the fundamental clash here. So, and just to pick up on another thread that you raised, Keith, the idea of conceding so much to the opposition, this is something that she emphasizes as a real problem with the conservative view. And I don't talk about this in the article that I wrote, but I definitely recommend people go and read her own article on this, which I link to and quote from extensively, Conservatism and Obituary, because she points out that this is an important dynamic of how principles work and how philosophical premises work. And when you concede something and your opponent stands on that for not just conceding it, but advocating that position, there's a certain logic to who's going to gain from that and who's going to lose. And she has an argument about how the American liberals and sort of incrementalist advocates of collectivism and socialism are themselves disarmed in the face of communism because they share the same principle, but the American liberals wanted to move in that direction slowly, but they can't argue against the communists. And she thinks that in the same way, the American conservatives are disarmed in the face of American liberals because they share the same moral premise. And the American conservatives can't really challenge anything that the collectivist, statist opponents advocate. So what happens, she argues, is that when American liberals advocate for something like the Peace Corps or supporting the rest of the world with foreign aid, the response from many conservatives is not, no, we shouldn't do that, that's immoral. It's, wait a minute, not Africa, it has to be Asia. So it's a question of implementation, or not the Peace Corps, it has to be a more practical program. It's the details that we're fighting over. But what's completely conceded is, this is the morally right direction. This is what we should do. And then, okay, if you want to quibble about the means and the process and the timeline, we can quibble about that. But once you've conceded all that, you're granting the moral sanction to that view. And then there really is no opposition, principled opposition you can give to it. So in effect, what you're doing is you're paving the road toward that ultimate goal, even if in your own view, you're opposing it because you're saying, no, our foreign aid shouldn't go to these countries, it should go to those countries. Well, you still think that foreign aid is an appropriate policy. So let's just, we can get to our endpoint this way, even if you're going to slow us down. So this is part of her conception that there's a logic to philosophic principles, and conceding fundamental ones to your opponents has a disastrous long-term consequence for you. And I think this is part of why she thinks of conservatism, and this is in the 60s, so many decades ago. She already saw it as bankrupt and impotent culturally, as having nothing to attract people and unable to do what it's claiming to be seeking to do, which is defend freedom, because it's conceding and letting freedom be eroded at every turn. And that is part of why I think she regarded as so morally bad that this is what conservatives were doing. So she has a really powerful way of capturing this, which is, I hope I've captured this right. So just take this as a paraphrase, not a quote. It's that a half battle is worse than none. Like if you're arguing in a way that's ineffective, you're really not doing your side any justice. You're actually helping the opponents, because you look ridiculous, and then the opponent looks much better as a result. And if you're conceding the fundamental premise, you're actually hastening its success. So this is one more reason I think people should go and read her view on conservatism, because there are really timeless philosophic insights here about the dynamics of how ideas shape movements and a culture more generally.
So before we turn to the next implication of what you just said, let's just give some thank yous to, we got some super chat donations here. Jonathan, Mary Elan, and someone with a handle can't quite pronounce, but we've gotten a few super chats, so thank you for sending those in. Now, so you've been talking, Elan, about some of the arguments that she puts forward in this talk that she gave, Conservatism and Obituary, which is also reprinted in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, the book. And so this was in 1960. So this is, very early on it's in the period following Atlas Shrugged. She already has a view that the conservative movement is completely intellectually bankrupt. The arguments it's advancing are worse than not even trying to argue, that it's a half battle, and it's conceding all the important principles to the enemy. And the only thing that can result from this is that this side of the political spectrum can only get worse and worse. And what's interesting is she's in effect predicting what the trajectory of the conservative movement is going to be in 1960. And as you see it develop through the 60s and 70s, gradually you start to see that everything she predicts about the movement is coming true. And so what I like about your article is you go from this early analysis in 1960 to a talk that she gave in 1980 or 81 towards the end of her life, and it's her perspective on what has become of the conservative movement by that time. So do you want to say a little bit about that part of it?
Yeah, so I think one way to sum up her view in the early 60s, and particularly the arguments in favor of freedom, is this is an abandonment of reason. The arguments from faith, depravity, from tradition, this is not at all what it looks like to give rational defenses of freedom. And it really goes against the tradition, if you're not in that sense, but sort of the legacy of the Enlightenment, which was putting reason and individualism at the forefront of thinking and political activity. So that was what she thought of in the 60s. And one way she characterizes it is, this is the voice of the dark ages rising again in industrial societies. It's just how incongruous it was for her to see this. And I think the way to capture her perspective, or some of her perspective, by the 1980s, or in 1981, the speech that you're referring to, is that voice of the dark ages just gets more strident and more powerful politically, because it's left to walk through some open doors, to use that cliche. And what happens is that the intellectual vacuum within conservatism becomes filled by people who have a view that the source of what conservatism should be, what the core of it is, more religion and a sharper turn against reason. So in this talk from 1981, The Age of Mediocrity, which we'll link to in the show notes, she looks at what is sort of in retrospect seen as the rise of the religious right in America. She thinks of the activists who are coming to the forefront as militant mystics. This is our term, or militant religionists, because they're pushing an agenda now, not half-hearted, not kind of in a, here's what tradition would tell us, but just, this is what conservatism is. It's about being close to God, and God is the sanction for what we need in society, and even worse things, as we'll see. But it's a view that if you think in the 1960s there's a bankruptcy and a turn away from religion, that trend really accelerates or becomes more central to what conservatism is about. By the time Ronald Reagan gets into power, early in his tenure. So in the talk, Ayn Rand analyzes some of the positions that she regards as rising to prominence and influence within conservatism. And these are things that, in the 60s would have been shocking to people, but by the 1980s, this is sort of like, okay, well, this is what conservatives are about. So things like creationism. You've done a lot of research on this, and so creationism is really just the biblical story of creation dressed up a little bit to look like science, or like a scientific account. And the advocates of this view were in effect saying, no, this deserves equal time with the theory that Darwin developed and later was built on. And that's you can tell us more about this, Keith, but it's really well established. I mean, it's a theory in the sense that it's an account, but it's well justified by the evidence. So this is in effect saying, we need to teach children that the story of creation has equal standing with a scientifically rigorous account of the origins of species. And that is a fundamental rejection of reason and science.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about that more in the Q&A, but I mean, it's basically taking the biblical story of creation and the flood, as the explanation for all geological phenomenon. I mean, and then just sort of slapping the label, science on it. I gave a talk once where I described it as, the movie This Is Spinal Tap, where he changes the number so it goes to 11, but really it's just 10 is just 11. That's basically what it is. They're just caught by, if they put the label science on it, somehow it's on the same footing as biology.
I want to stress the one other, so there's more to say about her analysis in that talk, and people should definitely go and listen to it. One other piece of the agenda that she analyzes as becoming salient and that is given political power, particularly the Reagan administration, not originating it, but giving it sanction, is the vociferous attacks on abortion, the idea that abortion should be illegal, the push against it. And for Ayn Rand, so there's a lot to say about her view of abortion, but she was convinced that abortion is a moral right and should be a political right of women, that it flows out of an understanding of what it means to be free and have autonomy and sovereignty over your own life, and being able to choose your own path in life, whether to have children, if you do want to have them, when you have them, and not being left to chance and happenstance. So her view is that this was one of the lowest aspects of what the new religionist push within conservatism was advocating for. You can tell us more about this too, Keith. You've talked about her view of abortion and the opposition to it. But one of the things that really comes out, and it's startling, I think, in her analysis, is another way in which she's really stands apart from conventional thinking, is that for her, it's a real question that can you have people like these advocates against abortion, the intellectual advocates and the political advocates, who really have the interests of women at heart? And her answer is no way. Like, you cannot honestly believe that these people are all concerned with the life of the woman. This is a rejection of human happiness and the ability of individuals to control their own life. And I think she has a very strong negative moral assessment of that.
Yeah, I think so. I think all of these things, creationism and the rise of the anti-abortion movement, these are all, and the rise of the moral majority, and the fact that Reagan sort of, helped to bring this into politics. I think these are all examples of a trend that she sort of was worried about in the 60s, and it came to fruition at the time that she's giving this talk, which is it's the rise of the idea that religion should play a role in politics. And I think this is what she's really rebelling against in this talk, The Age of Mediocrity, that she gives in 1981. And this is the danger that she sees as coming as a result of these. All these other things are concrete manifestations of that, and they represent threats to freedom and reason in their own right. But it's the fact that it's coming together as part of an expression of this resurgence of religion into politics that she's really worried about. And I think that's well captured in your article. And then, of course, people can read her original. You can actually hear her original talks or read them in the form of articles. But why don't we sum up here, because I think we're getting close to the end, and we should take some of these questions that we're getting. So, how would you summarize what we've covered? Why does Ayn Rand reject conservatism? I think it's pretty clear now.
I think the key point is that she saw it as a intellectually bankrupt movement, and the way in which that bankruptcy plays out is it necessarily is destructive of freedom in different ways and manifestations. So what is it that they're trying to conserve? So if we take their name seriously, well, it's not capitalism or freedom or even the original system as it was conceived. It's nothing like that. It's actually the mixed economy, the blend of freedom and pockets of freedom with growing elements of economic controls, regulations, and welfare programs. That's what she characterizes as the mixed economy, not freedom. So what they want is the status quo. And in her analysis, the status quo has long ago switched to becoming collectivist, statist, and anti-freedom in fundamental ways. And conservatives that she was criticizing were enabling that by having conceded the fundamental premise of what is a good life. And in their view, is altruism is the right view. And she thinks that is the factor that's really undermining freedom in America. I think that is at the top level. Then part of from going a little deeper into this, conservatism shifts. I think in the 60s it's marked, and it becomes more so as we've seen by the 1980s. And I think this is my view now. It's continued since then. It's this turn away from the core, the best elements of the Enlightenment, which are reason, individualism, and the idea that it's your life and it's for you to decide the path you take and how to achieve your own happiness, this idea of moral individualism, and the political manifestation, capitalism. This is a real turn away from that. I mean, she points out that conservative leaders in the 60s were afraid to use the term capitalism They didn't want to talk about it. It was almost like a dirty word in some sense. That's my characterization of it. You can see that she has an article about how they're dancing around the issue just in order not to have to talk about what is at the core, which is this moral foundation question. And I think this, just the final point I would raise in summing up the analysis, is that by packaging together faith and freedom, so telling people that religion and capitalism go hand in hand, they're inseparable, and having convinced a lot of people that that's true, even though it's not true, this has done enormous harm to the cause of spreading freedom and capitalism. Because if you're trying to attract the best sort of people who are looking for evidence and arguments and reasons and who are scientifically oriented, if you're trying to convince people like that that freedom is the right way to organize society, as you've mentioned earlier, the communists and socialists for many decades were selling themselves as the embodiment of science and free and progress, which is completely false. But there is this sort of view in the culture that if you're for science, then you're for collectivism and socialism and communism. And then the conservatives have reinforced that by saying, yes, that's true, because freedom goes with faith, capitalism goes with religion. Her view, I think, is that the packaging of those two elements, capitalism and religion on one hand, and collectivism and science on the other, both of those are false. They don't go together. And the result is that you turn off the best people. You send them to your opponents, because if you want science, you need to go to socialism and collectivism. If you're willing to accept faith and authority, you can just have freedom. And think about people, some of the people I admire in the contemporary world, a lot of them have come out of Silicon Valley, people like Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos. They're just incredible innovators, just heroic level innovation and thought and dedication to building a business. And that is the being on the scientific premise, whatever their personal views are, whatever their political views are, I think, but being that focused on developing products and building a business, you have to be fact-oriented. And I think it becomes a really positive influence on someone's life that they do that. If you go to someone like that and tell them, well, to take this perspective and make it a full approach to life, that means you have to have faith, and you need to ally yourself with creationism, and you need to disbelieve Darwin. Well, that's crazy, right? How could you possibly convince someone that, yes, in the rest of your life, what success means is following reason, but politically, forget it, you need religion and capitalism. That's just such a toxic packaging together of things that should not be seen as going together. So to me, this is part of one of the things that motivated me to look into this and write about it, is this point, and it seems like a passing comment, but it's really profound, is that the arguments that many conservative leaders were giving for capitalism were almost calculated to turn away the best, most thoughtful, most innovative people. The kind of the Howard Rorks of the world, right? If you've read The Fountainhead, you know what that refers to. Someone who's really independent-minded, doesn't put anyone's judgment above their own, and looks at the world first-handedly. That was sort of what animated Ayn Rand as an artist, like projecting that kind of heroic character. And she often thought about the world in terms of what is the best kind of society, best kind of person, meaning rational and committed to the facts. And I think this is part of how to see her disgust with what conservatism was doing. It was really turning off, I think, some of the most idealistic and rational people in those terms. So maybe we should turn to some of the questions. I'm sure we've activated people on some of these issues.
Well, I think so. Some of the questions seem to be operating on the premise that we're like attacking conservatives, or we're trying to criticize people who might view themselves as conservatives, which is not really what we're trying to do. What we're trying to articulate is what Ayn Rand's intellectual opposition to the ideas that were being put forward by leaders of the conservative movement were, and why she held those views, why she criticized them in that way, in order to convince people or to try to convince people that she has a better way of thinking about these things. So we have a super chat question that we'll take first. The question is, it says, unrealistic to expect most people to study philosophy at a deep level. Do you acknowledge that conservatives and libertarians are those who have the best chance of bringing into objectivism? And I guess what I would say to that is, it depends why they view themselves as conservatives or libertarians, and how interested in philosophy they're willing to go. Because I don't think you have to study philosophy at a deep level in order to, you have to be willing to think about some of the issues that we talked about today, the clash between altruism and egoism, and what moral foundations are required to establish political freedom. You know, that doesn't require getting deep into, you know, an analysis of Immanuel Kant, or like there's way deep you can go in philosophy. But I think to understand the differences between conservatism, libertarianism, and objectivism, you don't have to go that deep. And if the question is who do we have the best chance of bringing into objectivism, I mean, the people who are going to be interested in objectivism are people who are interested in questions about what are the right principles of morality for living one's own life and for establishing a free society. And it's not obvious to me that the best chance of getting people like that is going to come from the so-called right or the libertarians, in the way that Elan was just talking about, you know, the kind of Silicon Valley entrepreneur who's pro-science, you know, but who might see themselves as sort of a progressive leftist. As long as they're open to reason and they're willing to have their views challenged in a fundamental way about politics and morality, those people might be the best chance of coming into objectivism because they're so pro-reason and pro-science.
If I can build on that, Keith, just to add a couple of other aspects. One is, we haven't really talked about it in this conversation, except it's been in the background, but it's worth saying. When I said that she puts conservatism in scare quotes, I think that's because she doesn't think there's it doesn't denote anything clearly. There's a movement, there are people, but it's not like you can easily define it. It's a very elastic term, it's foggy, and deliberately so in her view. And she has the same kind of a view of liberals at the time, or what today you might call progressives. So it's not clear what it is that people, if you're thinking about people who identify that way, what is it that they're responding to? Maybe it's the better elements, or as the questioner seems to suggest, but it's not clear that if someone tells you they're a conservative, you know anything about what their views are. Because today at least, and I think this was true even in the past, there's so many views that fall under these nebulous terms that you just need to know more about the individual and what it is that they think before you can have a view of whether or not they will respond to Ayn Rand's philosophy. So that's one aspect I would raise. And I think it's the same as you make the same argument about liberals. What it is that someone responds to when they say they're a liberal, it's not a coherent view that you could point to and say, yes, if you subscribe to this, everything else follows. People are very eclectic on top of that. And then just one other thought about this is just to stress, this is not an analysis of people who identify as conservatives. It's Ayn Rand's view of the intellectual leaders of a movement and their negligence, their failure to advocate for the ideas of freedom. And a lot of what she's writing about, and she's addressing people who she believes have been misled into being supportive of conservatives. And she's trying to reach them, telling them, if we have this in common, if you and I both stand for freedom, I want you to understand what this movement is about. And I want you to see that advocating for freedom looks very different from what you're seeing today. So it's not, I don't think the right way to see this is she was out to bash people who thought of themselves as conservatives. Or nor are Keith and I in this conversation. It's on the contrary. If you really value the things that are claimed to be valued by conservatism, then you have to understand what it looks like to truly advocate them. And she encouraged people to see that it's a philosophic issue. It's not about sort of the horse racing election stuff, which has its place, but that's not the way to think of these issues.
Yeah, I think it's important that her 1960 talk, Conservatism and Obituary, was given on a college campus. She was talking to students, and she was trying to get them to think about what intellectual movements should they be supporting. And she was, as part of the talk, she's issuing sort of a rallying cry. If you really want to defend freedom, what you need is to embrace a radical reconceptualization of philosophy. In effect, you've got to understand objectivism. If you want to, you have to be a radical for capitalism, which means morally radical. So it's putting forward a positive vision of what ideas one should be advocating. That's what that was her main focus. So we have another question here. Did you have one you wanted to take up, Elan?
Well, there's an interesting question that has come up about raising the issue of tribal collectivism and social justice theory. And I want to just reframe the question a bit. So the question is asking, yes, we've been criticizing conservatism. Well, we've been talking about Ayn Rand's analysis of it in the past. We're not really talking about it in the present, though I definitely have views about what it is in the present. And so the question is, well, why aren't we talking a bit about some of the shortcomings or the basic problems with the other side? And I think if we can step away from the topic of the main topic of the discussion today, which was Ayn Rand's analysis, and talk a bit more about what it looked like to think about today's scene, I think one of the points she raised in 1981 is that conservatism was becoming not only religious and hostile to reason and science, it was becoming more tribal. And she talks about this elevation of the family. And she saw that as the that is tribal in sort of racial terms, and in other terms as well. I think there definitely is tribalism throughout our culture. And I think that's another manifestation of intellectual decay on both sides. So both among the people who think of themselves as conservatives, intellectual leaders and so on, and the people pushing, whatever you think of the other side, or the other advocates or opponents of them, there's no question that tribalism is rising. But what I'm challenging is that it's only on one side. I think tribalism manifests differently, definitely is more noticeable maybe for some people if you look at the social justice type arguments that people bring up and the emphasis on race now. But I think it's a mistake to think that it's localized. I think it manifests differently, and it's a problem in every manifestation.
Yeah, and just my take on the question. So the questioner is saying, today's podcast has been about conservatism. Could we also address the whole issue of social justice warriors and critical race theory? That's definitely something that we'll do on this podcast in the future for sure. But I think just picking up on what you just said, Elan, it's interesting that the tribalism has become so pronounced in our culture that if we do a podcast saying why Ayn Rand rejected conservatism, I think people just automatically think, well, if we're rejecting conservatism, then are we somehow on the side of, the social justice warriors and the left or something like that? Like you've got to be in one tribe or another. And what's interesting about Ayn Rand is the way that you can't pin her down politically because she had fundamental opposition to both the left and the right because her views are completely radical. And you have to look at her as an individual, and you have to look at her ideas on their own merit. You can't pin her down as being as part of one tribe or another. So today we're putting a spotlight on why she rejected conservatism, and definitely in other podcasts we'll talk about why she and why her philosophy rejects expressions of views that you would associate with the left or with progressivism and that sort of thing. So
I think we're past time, but let's take maybe one or two more questions and then tell people, wish we could answer all these questions on the live stream, but join us on Clubhouse. We'll be moving there in a few minutes. And we're happy to talk more about the topic of today's podcast and also take your questions and discuss some of these issues in a smaller group. So this question from the super chat, I'm not totally clear. I understand it, so I'll do my best to respond to what I think it's asking. So it's, as written, it's authoritarians that supported the draft weren't supporting capitalism. And I assume that this is a reference to the conservatives who weren't opposed to the draft or who were supportive of it. And then the question asks as well, or national service question mark. So I'm not totally sure what the question is driving at, but what's important, I think, in thinking about the draft, it was that Ayn Rand was standing apart again here in her opposition to the draft. This is the military draft, particularly if you think about during the Vietnam War. And her view was that it was morally wrong. It's one of the worst things a government can do to its people is to conscript them into the military at a time and send them into war against their own choice and in defiance of it. And she railed against this. And I think it's important that this was another reason for her disappointment with conservatives, because for her this is one of the starkest or more blatant ways in which a government can violate the rights of its own people and how it's completely inconsistent with freedom. And I think she was right to think that, well, why aren't the conservatives the ones sort of standing on the parapets and shouting about this? And I think there was a conspicuous lack of opposition to it. I mean, not to say no one opposed it. There were definitely people who did, and eventually it was undone, and which is a good thing. But this should have been a rallying cry for anyone who was on the side of freedom. And yet what you saw is people, I think some hippies and other people who were rejecting it for reasons that weren't very good. I mean, they were right to object, but their arguments weren't very convincing. So I think go read her article where she discusses the draft. So look it up in the Ayn Rand lexicon. I think the place to read her account in full is Wreckage of the Consensus, which you can find online. But it's another illustration of her view of what it is to defend freedom and how it is that, by contrast, so few people in the intellectual space and the political space really understand it. If they did, they couldn't honestly ignore the issue of the draft or treat it as they did. I think this is part of what her analysis of the left and the right, or the liberals and the conservatives of her time, brings out, is that they just simply are anti-intellectual. There's a progressive movement towards less and less concern with ideas. And this is in the 60s. So imagine, I would love to know what she would think of today.
Should we draw a line there and then we'll head over to Clubhouse in 5 minutes or so?
Yeah, let's do that. So why don't we wrap up and tell you a bit about some of the topics. If you want to explore them further, we have some resources to recommend. One of them is Ayn Rand's essay, Conservatism and Obituary, which, as Keith said, originated as a talk and then became adapted into an essay. You can find it in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, and online, bit.ly/conservatism obit, if you want to look it up there. We have other resources that you can look at. I wrote an article which summarizes some of Rand's views from that piece and other places, and also looks at how her views, what her views were in the 1980s on in the Reagan era. And that is, the title of that essay is What Was Ayn Rand's View of Conservatism? You can find that at bit.ly/AR versus conservatism, or VS for versus. And we should say that the talk that we've been referring to, The Age of Mediocrity, this is her, I think, the final four-hole forum that she gave herself, 1981, in response to Reagan coming into power and what does she see going on in the culture. You can find that also online, bit.ly/Age of Mediocrity. I highly recommend you listen to that. Fascinating analysis. Want to tell you that on July 21st, we'll dedicate this live stream podcast to a general Q&A. Ask us what you want about the objectivist philosophy. Send us your questions ahead of time to get them in the queue. We had a lot of questions recently when we did this. You can email us, newideal@aynrand.org. We'd love to hear from you. And if you send them early, you have a better chance of getting them in. So next week, we'll have another podcast. This time, we'll be talking about the situation with the vaccines. You might have seen many developments with those. On the one hand, people are being lured and bribed into getting vaccines because there's a lot of resistance with lotteries and hamburgers and all kinds of strange inducements to get people to get vaccinated. And then on the other hand, there are people who are saying we need to have mandates for this. So we'll be discussing the issues surrounding that next week. We hope to see you there. And as Keith mentioned, after we sign off here, we will be moving to Clubhouse. You can join us in the Ayn Rand Club. And if you need a link to Clubhouse, I know it's still restricted, you can find us on social media and we can link you with an invitation. I think there's a way for us to do that. Hope to see you there. And if you enjoyed today's discussion, please subscribe, click the bell to get notifications, leave us a comment. If you're on other social media platforms watching or listening to us, please like and share what you find and tell people. And if you want to suggest topics for us to discuss, if you have questions about what we've said, we'd love to get your feedback. Send us an email, newideal@aynrand.org. We read everything. We try to respond to as many as we can, but we love to hear from you. So please don't hesitate to drop us a note. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.